I'm here with Marilyn Morningstar, author of The Last Snapshot. Marilyn, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me. Appreciate it.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your story and some of your main characters. Can you tell me a little bit about Rena?
Rena. Oh, okay. Rena is actually from my original book, Neon Gods. She's the mother of Julia out of that story, and so chronologically, she's the first story in the series of the Age of Force and Neon. And Rena was adopted because she was left on the doorstep of a Jewish family in Berlin in a basket when she was an infant. But she was raised, of course, in this Jewish family, and she ends up going through the plight of the Jews. So that's an interesting story in and of itself, the whole thing that went on in Berlin, which is only really shown as a flashback, but you do find out a little bit about how that happened. And then they ended up moving to Poland, her uncle's farm.
So The Last Snapshot, being the first in this series, really introduces Rena. Is that correct?
That's true. It introduces Rena, and it introduces Rolf, which is the other main character, and he's an SS, but he got coerced, actually forced to do the SS work. But he's an art restoration specialist, so he's actually doing the loot. So all the loot that the Nazis are getting from all the other countries that they're conquering is coming into Warsaw, and he's calculating, he's appraising, he's restoring, he's shipping all of the loot that comes in, and that's everything from art to silverware, whatever it happens to be that's worth a value.
And these two characters, their story becomes intertwined as Rena and Rolf actually meet for the first time. Can you tell us a little bit about that interaction?
Yes, they do actually end up meeting coincidentally because she's, after the bombing happened in Warsaw, she went with her uncle into the town, and everything was blown up, and her friend his house was gone, and she didn't know where her friend was. And it happened to be that some kids were being really mean to some Jews and cutting off their locks and things like that, and in this little center where they were sitting waiting for the tram. And it turned out that Rolf just came by, and as Rena kind of lost her temper, she has a little bit of a temper, and she started screaming at the boys that were being really mean to the Jews. They started beating her up, and then this SS officer just happens to be walking by, stops those Jews, and ends up looking at Rena, and Rena looking at him, and they have a connection, and they both recognize it.
So the Warsaw Ghetto really was a grotesque place, and it was also a very important scene in your book.
That's true, and of course, as things go, it wasn't so grotesque in the beginning because it was just part of the city of Warsaw. And then slowly the walls were put around, all the Jews were collected up that lived around in the area, and Rena and her family were hiding for some time before they were eventually pushed into the area, which is kind of a little bit of a spoiler. But in that, there were diamonds to sell, and having to sell the diamonds to be able to get food to eat in the ghetto, she did end up going over and contacting Rolf again, who she'd also met at another time, and found when they met, he wanted to paint her face because she was really beautiful, and he was working on a painting, and from there they end up connecting. No spoiler alerts here. You'll have to read the book.
Exactly, and without giving up too much here, I mean, one of the most amazing things about your book is the fact that the things that these people went through in the Warsaw Ghetto, and certainly all throughout Europe as this, tragedy was unfolding, the things that they had to endure are really unimaginable to modern day, Americans, Europeans, because it's really hard to to understand, the extent to which humans can be cruel to one another. And as I understand it, your book is 100% accurate to the events, and you don't add anything. Is that correct?
The only thing that's added is the fictional characters. Everything else is to the minute. So I did about 3 years, it was about 8 years working on this book at one time, but 3 of those years was strictly research. So I've been to all the locales. I've put myself in the shoes of Rena and Rolf, and I've done an extensive amount, I can't even tell you how extensive amount of research to get everything accurate to the minute, in from people's accounts to books to internet research to meeting with people that lived through those times, many things to make sure that I got it right. I want people to have the experience of being in the shoes of Rolf, who is forced to be an SS and work for the SS. I want people to understand what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody that actually went through that. And so I gave it my full guts, basically.
And as these things are unfolding, and as Rena is having to endure these hardships, Ralph and Rena really grow close throughout the story.
Well, there is a time when, after they met a couple of little brief times, that they did come together. Rena needed to sell her diamonds. Rolf decided he wanted to paint her face and offered her a job. So she actually was able to get out of the Warsaw Ghetto and buy food for her family because of this meeting with Rolf.
And as this book kind of comes to an end, as the first part in the series, really in a very unique way, it's actually very touching to see the development of these characters and how they're able to endure through, what was one of the worst ghettos in Europe at this time.
That's true. I guess from the reader's standpoint, from what people have been telling me, is this is a unique story that's never been even closely told before. There's nothing that if it comes close to this type of an ending of the story. And so that is, actually, I want to talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The entire basis for this story is actually the last chapter. And that happened when I was working on my first book, Neon Gods. I was writing the mother's story, and in writing the story, I was sitting at the computer one day, and I just had a couple of sentences. I thought, okay, they met, this thing, this happened. I wrote a couple of sentences, and from there, for about 2 hours, my fingers were going, tears were streaming down my face, and the story basically wrote itself. I had no intention of writing this last chapter. It came to me as in a vision or a dream, or was manifested by somebody else taking my fingers and putting them on the keys. I can't deny that. And even though I'm not a religious person, I know something happened there, and I can't explain it. But that was what my editor wanted me to cut out and change, and I refused to do so, because the last chapter of the last snapshot, I can't help but believe that it actually happened.
And really, it's something that the readers really need to experience for themselves. Marilyn Morningstar, the author of The Last Snapshot. Marilyn, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.